Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Learners Podcast. I intentionally did not do a millennial pause. Gen Z's in the chat. You can let me know if I actually did it correctly or not. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Carl Pearson. Carl works at a company you probably know called Reddit. I use it all the time. Our NBA subreddit. I'm on it all day, every day, hearing all the rumors about who's getting traded and who sprained what ankle. So that's pretty cool. And today we're going to talk about primarily quantitative research. Carl, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Sweet. First thing right off the bat. So you're a staff UX researcher at Reddit, which means you know some stuff about quantitative research. That is, I think, definitionally true. So I want you to give us your take. NPS, use it or lose it. Here we go.
It's the classic researcher answer. It depends. I mean, if the team's already using it and it's totally embedded, like there are ways to get value from it, I would never choose it at the outset. So if it's already there, you have historical data, I wouldn't trash that necessarily, but I definitely wouldn't pick it if I had a green field to work with.
What would you pick if you, let's say you're walking into a new team, there is no historical data, maybe they're scaling up, thinking about doing some more systematic quantitative evaluations of how things are going on with their product and their customer base. What would you think of as an appropriate, single survey question that you would use?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the most fun I can have is like putting a ton of time into a very specific point in like a single question. So, yeah, it's like really depends on what the team is looking for. I think the closer you can get to, the more specific you can get, the more valuable it's going to be. The more movement you're going to see, the more broad you get, the closer to like general satisfaction you get, the more it's going to be kind of stable. And there's going to be so many inputs to it that it's a little hard to track like if what you're doing affects it. That said, I have used satisfaction in certain places like really high level CSAT. But if the team has specific goals, it's fun to dive in and say like, what does this team care about? What makes this product or this part of the product different than other things, and not just taking something off the shelf, but really crafting it and going through kind of the whole like psychometric process at a bit more of like an industry pace to get something really customized for a team.
I feel like we're already getting into a level of strategy around quantitative research that most qualitative oriented researchers are not exposed to. So why don't we back up a couple of feet here? And, when you think about the work of being a real leader on the quantitative research side, you come into a team, what do you think are the core skills you're bringing to the table, and how are you going to help the team win at a high level?
Yeah, I think coming in as the only quant at Reddit, I think this is getting more typical as the quant like position proliferates. It's not something where you hire a qual and then hire a quant. You typically already have like four, five, six, seven, eight quals already. So, coming in, there is that kind of unique viewpoint that I bring, which is like creating those more customized metrics and going through maybe the more rigorous processes that aren't as familiar to folks. But then it's also setting up things that get other people more comfortable with running surveys. Like I'm sure every researcher has run some level of a survey, like on their face, they're pretty easy to set up. There's a lot of tools for them. But getting to a higher level of quality, a higher level of comfort, those are things that I've been working on to help the team really up level their skills.
Can you give me an example of a a custom metric that you've implemented on the team, and a little bit of where it kind of came from?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, some of this stuff I think is probably veering more into confidentiality, but I'll say maybe vaguely you could piece it together as looking at like what a company's mission is or something like that could lead you down some interesting paths. Or if you, have a very specific feature that all of your users care about, you might ask about, how effective they are or how satisfied they are with that one little feature rather than just like, hey, how satisfied are you with this overall? So there's a couple ways you can go. Unfortunately, I probably can't get into the exact metric as much as I would like to dive into the
Could we
details
could
there.
we do like a hypothetical here? If I give you a scenario and then
Yeah,
you can
totally.
try and analogously implant your head. So so let's imagine you were dumped into, let's say, TikTok, right? A lot of user generated content. I guess social networky vibes, similar ish to Reddit. What would be some of the types of metrics that you could envision yourself implementing at a company like TikTok?
Yeah, I think one thing TikTok does really well is they're very geared towards sharing with friends within the platform. It's very easy to share videos to friends, even share comments from other videos to friends. So one thing that I could imagine one of the core product teams being interested in is like, how easy or difficult is it to share content with their friends? So we might craft a metric or like kind of even a short set of questions that gets at like how easily, how effectively, how satisfying is it to connect with your friends over this content. So not just like how good is the content or how good is TikTok, but like if I'm kind of making this up here, I imagine the team might be really interested in that kind of social sharing value. We might
Hmm.
get into that specifically, like how easy is it for you to share this stuff with your friends?
Got it. I think that makes sense. So, um, when you see the surveys that are being run on research teams, not necessarily with somebody from a quant background, what are the typical feelings you get when you open up the files and take a look under the hood? Is it kind of like a eek situation, or are you like, okay, this is fine, or you're like, this is really good, or is it mostly like shit?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some oh shit moments where it's clear, something should have been an interview. Like there's tons of open-ended questions. It's not really like I can't even understand what the hypotheses might be going into
Mhm.
it. I see a lot of surveys that are more like I would say middle of the road. Like they aren't making grave errors. Like they're not having tons of double-barreled questions or like probably using the MPS where it doesn't fit or something like that. But I can tell the researcher may not quite have like an analysis plan in mind. I think that's the hard thing to do is like you can think of the questions, but it's like, how are you actually going to put these numbers together in a way that tells a compelling story? So it's
Mhm.
kind of like, yeah, they know what they wanted to learn, but they didn't think about how to structure what they wanted to learn in a way that would let them actually like do the analysis and provide something compelling to stakeholders. They might just have like a bunch of kind of descriptive stats or like they're really digging in on demographics. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really care about demographics most of the time. I care about like what that demographic is related to behaviorally, but I just, I'm not going to design my app differently for a 25-year-old versus like a 40-year-old if they share the same behaviors. So that stuff's like not super relevant. So I see a lot of like kind of classic demographic questions get thrown in and yeah, it seems like they may not really have a plan for like how this is going to end up and tell a compelling story.
Yeah. um, I want to get into some really tactical stuff for the community to be able to dig into here. um, did you have like a math background, a stats background? um, just before we get into that, if you could tell folks a little bit about what kind of led you into this kind of a role from a skill development or qualification point of view.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in psychology, and I did a little bit of stats there. I was like, "This is okay. I guess I need to use this to like design cool experiments." And I wasn't big on math. In middle school, like I was in the lower math class. Same with high school. And then when I got to grad school, the first time I actually got real data, and I realized I got to make the models to figure out answers to my own
Mm,
questions. I was like, "Holy shit! Like this is really cool."
this is what
Like
math is for.
yeah, this is
Incredible.
it's actually for something. It's not just like memorizing random algebraic equations. It's like I'm going to get something I want to learn out of this. So that was the moment that catalyzed it for me. And from there, I continued in my PhD program, human factors psychology, to take more advanced coursework and sort of an elective basis to just because I was like, oh, I can answer more questions in a better way the more tools I have. So I just kind of went down this rabbit hole that led me a little bit into like coding and R, where it got, kind of itched that like puzzly part of my brain where I'm like figuring stuff out and it's really hard, but I break through and I get to look back and say, hey, I did that. It runs every time. This is super cool.
Yeah, I remember that there was like a moment like a year ago where for the first time I had to like figure something out, and it was like a binomial equation or something. No, what was it? What's it called when you have multiple exponents of the same variable? I don't know.
I don't think I have the vocab word for that.
Okay, cool. There was like some really basic level calculus. Fuck, I don't even know. Maybe it's just algebra. And I'm like, my grade 12 math teacher was right. I do need this. But then I
Yeah.
just asked ChatGPT. It worked out great. I don't have to figure it out. But good to have that background before you're getting into this stuff. So let's talk about when we were chatting. There was something you wanted to dig into, which I think is a really great um, concept to learn more about and really hone in on. And it also really, I think it applies to, there's a way in which this applies to qualitative research as well, which is the concept of confidence intervals, right? And I think even confidence in general. There's a really great talk at last year's UXR Conf by this guy Joris Dreyer, who was prior to UX research, he worked for the Oakland Athletics doing the whole Moneyball thing, like
Mm,
the movie Moneyball. So he
yep.
was like the assistant to Jonah Hill, and they talked about how they used longitudinal, like same metrics with small sample sizes, but they did it longitudinally to build confidence and whatnot. And I'm like, that sounds really smart, cool. But it comes back to this idea of like how strongly do we feel we know what we know, essentially. So can you give us a quick rundown on what exactly is a confidence interval and how is it used from like a math sense?
Yeah, confidence intervals are kind of the most basic tool you can use to take your survey from sort of just like a qualitative screener type survey to something that is, firmly quantitative. So just getting like an average or like a mean, that's useful, but it doesn't really tell you how sure you are about what you found. So the confidence interval, if you look at
Can
it
I,
from
can
like
I
a
pause
really,
you real quick?
yeah.
When you say how sure you are, like let's even dig in there. What does that mean?
Totally. Yeah, so this is where statistics get like kind of weird when you get too in the weeds, and I think about this a lot, so I have it off the top of my head, but you kind of have to look it up a lot because it's so weird. Like if you have 95% confidence intervals, which I'm sure people kind of hear that that's like the standard number, the kind of lay interpretation of that is like, oh, we're 95% sure that the real answer is within this confidence interval. What it actually means is if you ran this exact same study 100 times, you would get the same mean within the confidence intervals 95 times. So it's not even like the true answers in here. It's more just like if we were to run this study 100 times, 95% of it, like this answer we got would be within this confidence interval. So it's very like pedantic and specific. So I often don't share that with like product stakeholders. I kind of use some shortcuts because I think you can lose people a lot. A lot of what good quant research is kind of like knowing the right way to do it and not forcing everyone to learn the like super specific explanations for what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that broke my mind. There's like some famous study around a bunch of like doctors that went to some super elite school that were given a really basic probability question, like bit of a riddle, and I think almost all of them got it wrong. And it had to do
Yeah.
with like false positives and false negatives and that sort of thing. And almost all these extremely highly trained elite doctors couldn't do this because the talking about probabilities, the math gets really tricky, and I find myself like with the p values, which is uh, p value. That's essentially, is that the what's the technical term for that? That's not the confidence interval. The
It's
p value.
related to it. So if you
Yeah,
have a 5% confidence, if you have a 95% confidence interval, your p value is at 5%. So
is
it's
that
kind of
fine?
like the other side of the coin.
Yeah. So the every time that I had to do anything with a p value when I was an undergrad, I had to like say it out loud to for myself, like, okay, if we did this experiment 100 times, one times out of 100, it would not, or whatever it is, and because it is really tricky, like it's English words we're saying, but it's almost like a different language.
Yeah, tons of jargon like built on every word. And even when you get to the, p value, you can have something that's super significant and still actually not practically important. Like if you have a big enough sample size, you'll detect something that is like, we're sure that this value is different than this value, but pragmatically that difference is like super, super
Mm-hmm.
tiny. So there's even more like factors and numbers to consider for like, should the team care about this even beyond just statistical significance?
Yeah. So let's talk about how do we use so in our practice as researchers, how should we be using confidence intervals?
Yeah, at a basic level, again, it kind of lets you level up your surveys into like a full quant survey. So if you are ever crafting like a mean or an average or a median or anything like that, you can always put a confidence interval around it. And that's going to tell you roughly, kind of we're taking some shortcuts here, like the range you would expect to see reasonably how this applies to the whole population of users. Because we're not normally concerned with the 50 or 300 users we specifically surveyed. We want to know how this applies to every single user that is using the platform. And what a confidence interval does is it lets us make, with a few parameters, like a very specific, guess you could say about like, this is how this applies to everybody.
So if Reddit has 100 million users, is that in the ballpark?
Yeah.
So if Reddit has 100 million users and you want to know roughly what these 100 million users think about their DMs messaging experience, the idea is you can send a survey to 500 of them. And based on how closely aligned the answers are, and I think it has to do with the variance of the answers, how different they are, you can say with a certain amount of confidence, cool, that means 100 million people feel this way. Or we don't know if 100 million people feel this way.
Yeah, or we might split it up into groups like new and old users. We can say that new users feel, more satisfied or less satisfied than these older users, and we can say like we believe this at that sort of 95% confidence world that we're living in.
So, how does this play out in meetings as you're delivering these results from studies you're running? Because, one of the canonical gripes that qualitative researchers have is they'll get into the room and they'll say, here's what we learned. And then some annoying lead product manager will be like, how many people did you talk to? It's only 8 people. I don't give a shit. We're doing the other thing, right? And that's really annoying. It's frustrating. And look, every researcher has to like learn how to handle that. It's part of your skill set. It's something you should expect. Don't be surprised when it happens to you. But in your case, right, you not only obviously have a larger sample that you're often working with, but you have this tool in your toolkit where you can like reach into your pocket and say, aha, I have this confidence interval. So how does this actually play out in conversations you have when you need to like whip this thing out?
Yeah, sometimes we're lucky in that PM is just wanting more numbers and we have
Mm-hmm.
them. So they're more confident in it. But then other times that same PM is going to be a stickler and be like, "Well, 500 isn't enough." Or, "How did you sample these people?" Or like they're going to kind of pick apart your methodology no matter what. So sometimes it does like we just cut to the chase and we can move forward faster. But
Mm-hmm.
other times, like people are really going to interrogate your methods, sometimes for valid reasons, and sometimes just because like that, is their personality type. So it kind of depends again on like what that stakeholder's bone to pick is. But I do find it helps, especially at like exec level, to have those numbers. Those do tend to carry a little bit more weight. That's more what they're used to seeing.
So would you say there is some meaningful proportion of stakeholders who you can say, here's our confidence interval, and they'll say, oh, all right, cool. I guess we can take that for granted.
Yeah, I would say that is definitely a leg up for quant compared to qual. I don't think that should be the case. Like I understand the value of a qualitative, like interpretive exploration of data and how it has different goals. So I'm not arguing that should be the case, but I think that is maybe one lucky piece that is outweighed by other things like do they actually know how to interpret a confidence interval? Are they going to get like lost in the weeds of some technical things? And I kind of have my own tricks to, navigate the other downsides that come with the quant world.
Yeah. Um, Let me throw some things at you here. So one of the things that you had already mentioned is, sometimes you can have a really high confidence interval, and it doesn't mean like there's nothing meaningful that comes out of it. So your confidence is 99.999%, p-value of super small, and you know, for example, you can say, well, the new users are satisfied with our, posting experience at 91.3%, and the older users are at 91.1%, right? And so, you do that study, you run that thing, and it's like, well, I don't know what we do. Like, did we learn anything? I mean, it's technically, I guess you learned something, that there's no difference, which is something. Um, One of the things that I think is true about qualitative research and whatnot, a lot of the times we're doing research on things that are very different, right? So brand new onboarding experience or brand new feature that's never existed before, and we're working with smaller, like really small samples, but the differences are conceivably huge, right? So So, for example, we can look at, say, Reddit has an onboarding rate of, from sign up to being an active user. I don't know, let's make it up. It's 30%, right? And we make a new onboarding experience, and we see we did this with 12 people, and 11 out of them finished the onboarding, and we're happy with it, right? Um, how can we interpret that information from the toolbox that you have to say, like, okay, how confident are we that we have something great here?
Yeah. So Jeff Sorrow, who runs the Measuring You consultancy, has a lot of great blog posts around this stuff, and he wrote one about small sample sizes and how we can still use statistics. So, like, we would have that completion rate 11 out of 12. If you were comparing 10 out of 12, you're probably not going to find like a big difference there. But the confidence interval for that is probably still going to be higher than that 30% kind of like average we know from all users. So you could still actually find some statistical significance against that benchmark of 30%. So you still can apply certain kinds of confidence intervals to even very small amounts of data. And I think that's something people aren't very familiar with. I think the challenge there is then, are the people that signed up for your usability test representative of the random person that kind of gets into this flow out of the tens of millions? Like, maybe not so much, but you can still incorporate some of that quantitative information to say, based on the people we sampled, this looks a lot better, and we actually see that with our confidence intervals.
Got it. So for folks who are looking to add more to their quantitative toolkit, right? I think there's just more. I think this is true across every area of work, discipline of work. Where people are organizations are expecting more. And that means, more output, more skills, more capabilities, all that sort of stuff. And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about, whether or not this is an area of growth for them. Two lines of inquiry here. One is, we now know with, like, for example, tools like Claude from Anthropic, you can go into Claude and say, build me a calculation tool that will measure variance, right? And it will give you a web application in all of 10 seconds that looks certainly like it measures variance. Good idea or bad idea?
It depends on how much you know already about measuring variance, because I definitely use LLMs to speed up my coding.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certainly points in every analysis process where I use it where it makes a significant error. And if I know to say, hey, like, you broke that assumption, that's not right, it will correct itself and we'll keep moving. But if you don't know what to look for, you could kind of go down this sort of failure drift where you're just way down a decision tree that has like multiple big issues. So you kind of need to know the basics to really effectively put that stuff to use. And the tricky part about quantitative research is, like, yeah, it'll give you a number and that number will look real, but you got to know, like, a priori, like, is this a valid number to work with?
Right. I saw a great tweet, which was, you know, uh, ChatGPT, can't remember, LLMs or whatever are amazing. They give you these great answers, that are always great, always seem right. And then you talk to them about something that you are like a deep expert in, and it's right it's wrong 40% of the time, right? And you're like, oh, it's not right about this, not right. And then it makes you think, right?
Totally.
Like, oh man, if it's only right about 40, or if it's wrong about 40% of my stuff, um, can I trust what it
Yeah,
says about everything else?
you got to be careful for sure.
Yeah. The second thing is, okay, so this is an area where we want to keep exploring and go deeper, and etc. Um, uh, where do you think is a good place to start for folks that are trying to get into the quant stuff? I would hazard a guess that just about every qualitatively oriented researcher can add, subtract, multiply, and divide. I think every researcher understands things like fractions and decimals and percentages. I'm pretty sure everybody knows about exponents and square roots and that sort of thing. Algebra, doing the polynomial equations, maybe not. Stats, I think everybody can probably do some basic functions in an Excel spreadsheet. So if we take that for granted and as our baseline, where would you recommend people start?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a few different sort of pillars in it. It matters like what you already have a lot of skills with. Because say you are just like the qual screener wizard, like you might have a bunch of really good um, survey knowledge that already applies. So you don't need to focus in on surveys as much. If not, maybe you start on like kind of the core of survey design. For the math itself, again, like confidence intervals are really that most basic place to start. They're not perfect, but they're like a conservative look at how things level up to the population. So that's a really good one. And what's cool about this year versus 4 or 5 years ago is there are a lot more free resources. There are a lot more books that have been published on this stuff, like for a UX research lens specifically.
Mm.
There's like the Quant UX conference now, so there are a lot more resources out there than there used to be. I just wrote a post on my blog to kind of direct this because I get this question a lot, and so it's kind of like figure out where you're weak. Is it the statistics? Is it the survey design? Is it kind of like dealing with bigger data, so you need some programming skills? And then tailor that to like what you need to know based on the skills you already have.
Yeah, it's cool with the confidence thing, just because I feel like it's a really good. It can be used in a lot of different scenarios, and it's. I think even if you don't know exactly what it means all the time, like you got to whip out the math dictionary to remind yourself exactly what the right phrasing is of that. I think as a vibe check tool, I think it's pretty good, right? Like if the number is
Yeah.
really high, it's a really positive vibe check.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with looking stuff up. Like I think that was my early imposter syndrome of like, oh man, I'm coding in R and I'm on Stack Exchange too much or like trying to build this model. But it's like, no, that's how everyone does it. Like, ChatGPT is just sort of like a Stack Exchange summarizer is essentially what that is. So, whatever you're using, but I think yeah, you don't have to have all the answers. You can be referencing stuff. And confidence intervals are just there aren't a lot of assumptions you need to use them well. There's a couple, but compared to like building more complicated models, like they're pretty easy and they're relatively intuitive. And even if you don't have that wording like quite right in your head, you're probably going to reach the same conclusion for your team anyway.
Yeah. Um, do you think that looking ahead a few years that you're going to see a much higher prevalence of mixing between qualitative and quantitatively oriented researchers in terms of the skills that people bring to the table? I see, a lot of times you see job postings for like mixed methods researchers and whatnot. And a friend of mine who knows the stuff um, has told me about a lot of the times that she's interviewed people for expressly mixed methods roles. Like you need to know how to program on R, right, at some base level, for example. And 9 times out of 10, the quant knowledge is just not. It's not there. It's like my level, which is again, pull out the spreadsheet, add, do a sum, calculate an average. It's all good. Um, do you think that that's more of the direction we're going to go, or do you think we'll go into more specialization within each of those sides of the equation?
Yeah. I mean, I think previously mixed methods was more of like the default. Like when you look at kind of some of the founders of the UX research world, a lot of them had these mixed methods toolkits. Even folks that I know that have been in the field for a long time and are anthropologists, like, just kind of figured it out. I think, like you said, maybe you just have kind of a few skills for some adding, subtracting, whatever, but a lot of it starts with just the ability to dive in and say, yeah, I don't know exactly how to do this, but like I'm going to figure it out. Like that's kind of my whole story. Like by the end of my PhD program, which was, kind of like the more prestigious way to learn statistics, like felt like I was winging it the whole time. And at the end, like I was doing stuff my professors didn't know. And I had to be like just reading a lot and putting in the effort to figure it out. So I think it's like just having a willingness to not be afraid of the numbers, even if you don't know them yet, and start to tackle them. And I think we're going to see that continue to grow. We're at an interesting point where research is possibly becoming more commodified. We have all these tools to make it so much easier to do qualitative and quantitative research, especially like the boring kind of ops parts have been sped up so much that I think it's going to leave more time for the complex analytical decision decision making sides of it that you're going to start to have more time to do research, and you'll probably start to end up with more research questions. Some of those are going to be quantitative, so it's going to be a useful tool to have.
All right. Carl, this was some good advice. Is there any one or two resources that you think are just 10 out of 10 reads or listens or anything like that that you would refer folks to if they are starting out on this journey?
Yeah, my go-to is Quantifying the User Experience by Jeff Sorrow and Jim Lewis. This book is really good for kind of just like you're familiar with working in the product space. It's going to get you to those confidence intervals like very quickly. If you're like, I want to be a full-on quant UXR and really go all in on this, then Quantitative User Experience Research by Chris Chapman and Kerry Rodden is kind of the book that's going to go beyond the confidence intervals and really deep dive into more things like like log data analysis and max diff and these more specialized areas. So those are kind of my two go-to resources. Both of them are books that are available online.
All right, time to get cracking. Let's read some books. I also loved what you said about figuring it out. I think, especially when I talk with folks that are, just starting out, they're students, they're graduating soon, or they're trying to land their first job. There's this feeling that everybody's got to be fully baked to land the role, and that's, as far as I can tell, it's just not true.
Yeah, definitely
Um,
not.
yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining, Carl. If you have questions, for maybe we can have a follow-up conversation at some time soon. But I think this is a really great area for us to like continue to dive into and explore some more quantitative research. Let's learn it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Great to chat with you today.
Cool. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to learn a little math today. Woohoo!